what the United States has done is largely turned its back on many of the core elements that define the system that it put into place. So if you look today at the world as it exists, the United States is, once again, the leading protectionist country in the world. It has gone from, broadly speaking, having the lowest tariffs in the world to, roughly speaking, having the highest tariffs of any industrialized country in the world, any advanced industrialized country in the world. It has gone from being a country that believed in the international system that it had put into place to one that openly violates. And I think the openly violates it part is important. The United States made many mistakes, violated those principles often, but it always tried to frame its actions in the context of a country trying to uphold those. So, for example, the Bush administration's war in Iraq. The Bush administration went to the United Nations, tried to get resolutions, had inspectors put in place, all done by an international organization and in pursuit of international objectives, tried to frame the issue in broad terms that affected the whole world, gathered a coalition of 40 plus nations, went to the United States Congress, and then went to war with Iran. Now, the war may have been misguided, but there was an effort to put it in the context of this larger international order that the United States believed in and was part of. The current war in Iran has none of those features. There was no effort to frame it in larger terms. There was no effort to go to the United Nations. There was no effort to go to Congress. The United States has exactly one ally, Israel, and that is not an oversight. That is, I think, by design. The Trump administration doesn't believe in any of those features. It wants the unilateral exercise of American power for American national interests, as it conceives it, to be the primary motivating force that defines the way the United States acts in the world. And that is a huge shift. And it is one that I think makes it very difficult to imagine how this international order survives. At the very least, it will need to be reconceived, almost recreated in some way if it were to survive. I think that the challenge going forward is even broader than the one I described, because if you go back before the United States, the leading power in the international system was Britain. And while again, British, you don't need to tell somebody who grew up in India just 20 or 30 years after the British were ruling the country. Britain could very often violate many of the values that it supposedly upheld. But Britain also had a kind of liberal international conception of its role in the world and of the international system. It was much more nascent, much more intermittently expressed. But if you go back to the 1870s, 1880s, what you see in William Gladstone, the four-time Liberal Prime Minister of Britain, what you see in some of his writings and speeches is the beginning of what I would call the kind of liberal international view of world affairs, as articulated by a statesman. There have been people like Kant who had articulated it much earlier. But to have a sitting prime minister, as Gladstone was, talk about the role of human rights in foreign policy, the necessity for Britain to act in support of, the Bulgarians or whoever it was being oppressed in those days by the Ottoman Empire, was unusual. It was the first time you had a major power want to act in ways that were more about some kind of broader values. And of course, the Gladstone's tradition gets transmuted into Wilson and Woodrow Wilson, and Wilson then makes an effort at the first international organization, the League of Nations, which of course collapses because the United States, in part because the United States never participates in it. And so you have really had an international system that for 150 years has been animated by a liberal hegemon that has been willing in some way or the other to articulate it and in some way or the other to underwrite it. London was the world's financial capital before New York. The British pound was the reserve currency before the dollar. The British Navy was the guarantor of freedom of the seas and also involved itself in certain liberal foreign policies like the abolition of the slave trade, which was done almost entirely by the use of the British Navy. And so when you think about it today, you are confronting a world in which the great liberal hegemon, the United States, is retreating from that role, maybe even turning its back on that role. Other great powers are rising, and they have not a very clear conviction or disposition to extend that particular conception of international order. And so you enter into a world that Charles Kindleberger, the economist, described very well when he was talking about the 1920s. Britain was losing its capacity to play that role in the international system, and the United States at that point had no interest, was too parochial, too isolationist, too uninterested in playing that role. And that created the power vacuum of the 1920s that led to the rise of dictatorships and aggression in the 1930s. I'm not in any way predicting that will happen. There are a variety of reasons why it might not. But that is the nature of the challenge of the order we face. It's a period similarly in flux and similarly undefined at the moment. So into this international flux enters India as a very different country than it has been in the past. India is now, I don't know whether one would call it an upper middle power or a great power, but India is one of the most important countries in the world, without any question. It is the third or fourth largest economy in the world, the most populous country in the world, and has achieved, and is achieving, I should say, a level of economic and technological sophistication that is new. If any of you have the latest iPhone in your pocket, the iPhone 17, it was made in India. Every single iPhone 17 was made in India. About 25% of all smartphones and about 50% of all iPhones are now made in India. And what is remarkable about that is, particularly on the iPhone dimension, if you go back 4 years, 0 were made in India. This is India essentially replacing China as the principal manufacturer of smartphones for the United States within 4 years. It is the kind of thing you used to believe that only China could do, which is a kind of high precision manufacturing at scale. It was always thought that you needed the kind of discipline and direction that the Chinese state could provide, which allowed for this kind of thing. And to a large part, it used to be true. I had a friend who was a CEO who had factories in China and India, and I told him, "What is the big difference between operating in China and India?" He said, "In China, when you go to these factories, people are very obedient. They just execute, and it's very hard to get them to tell you, give you any feedback, tell you what's wrong with what's going on." And I said, "In India?" He said, "In India, it's the opposite. You can't get people to shut up. Every worker has 3 ideas about how if they were owning the factory, they would transform it." I don't know whether that's true anymore, but for some reason or the other, while talking too much, the Indians are also making a lot of stuff and are doing it at a very, very high level. If you look at almost every area of advanced economics now, India has begun to participate. And remember, it's still, the potential remains huge because India is still a poor country. This is one of the things I now have to tell American friends when they are going to India, because in the old days, you had to tell them, I don't know if you'll be able to handle the poverty, and they were expecting it to be worse, and they'd go there, and I'd say, don't worry, you will be able to get a good meal, you will be able to stay in a clean hotel room. Now, when you go to India, you have to, people are expecting to see Shanghai, and you have to remind them, India's per capita GDP is still $3,000. It is still a country that is very much developing, but it has enormous potential, and it is realizing that potential. And what that means is India's foreign policy is changing. If you think about the India of the 1950s, to a certain extent, Nehru's foreign policy of non-alignment was born of necessity more than out of some grand articulation of values. India was a country that was not really powerful enough to be able to shape the international order. And so it wanted to avoid being shaped by it and stay out of the kind of great battle of the time, the Cold War. And that was there was a certain pragmatism to it. And the reality that Russia was close and that America had sided with Pakistan added to those dimensions. But it was a way of India not participating by staying removed and distant from the great tectonic struggle of the time. But India today is in a very different position, and therefore the non-alignment has moved to a multi-alignment. And multi-alignment, as Prime Minister Modi has expressed it and practiced it, is a much more active foreign policy in which India chooses how it will align itself and how it will conduct itself, and is able to do that because it occupies such a central place, both economically and strategically, that countries have to accept that India will not be entirely in their camp, but will do business with them nonetheless. So India is unusual in being able to buy Russian military equipment, buy Russian oil at a discount, while at the same time forging closer and closer ties with the United States, even militarily, even in defense terms. It is able to work out economic arrangements with Russia and at the same time with Europe. And that reality comes out of India's pivotal position. So I talked about the economic side, but obviously there is the strategic side that is even more significant, which emanates from the single most important strategic reality or strategic shift of the last few decades, and that is the rise of China. The rise of China has completely reordered the international system. If you think about it, the rise of China is really the first new entrant to the great power club in about 100, 150 years, right? Since the rise of Germany and Japan, you have not had a new entrant at that level. China represents that and represents a lot more because it comes out of a very old tradition. It comes out of a part of the world that has not had many great powers. And it is transforming the geography of Asia and the geopolitics of the world. And in that context, the world is searching for some kind of Asian balancer to China. And India seems to be the most obvious candidate because it can do it geopolitically, but it can also do it geoeconomically. If you think about the example I gave about the iPhone, it's very difficult to imagine any other country being able to, as quickly and as it did, and on the scale that it did, come into that market and provide a kind of alternative to China. And India can do that in phones, it can do it in other manufactured goods, it can do it in pharmaceuticals, it can do it in precursor chemicals, it can do it in minerals. It can do it in almost every area because of the size of India, the scale of it, and because of the fact that India does have fairly advanced technology and science. Manmohan Singh used to say that India exists in several centuries at the same time. And that is true for anyone who's ever visited India. You go to Bangalore and it feels like you're in the 21st century, and you go to Bihar and it feels like you're in the 17th century. And that reality is actually now turned into an advantage because you can get low-cost labor in Bihar and high-quality engineering in Bangalore. And that means that India has this extraordinary, maybe unique role that it can play. Now, the current administration has not seemed to completely recognize that reality for India with its tariff policy, but it's fair to say that that is not just true of India. The Trump administration has not discriminated on the basis of race, religion, or geography. It has abused all its allies, and so India is only one among many countries that is bewildered by the fact that it has been placed in this position, trying to understand what it means, and some of it I think will sort itself out. But the longer strategic outreach that the United States has made to India over the last 25 years is, I think, likely to endure, because it is rooted in the geoeconomic and geopolitical realities that I was describing. And so I think that there is a new weight to India in the world. The potential, in a sense, is already being realized in that sense.